I can hear you.
Yeah, all right, all right. How are you?
Hey, doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm good. I started the meeting a little early. I didn't mean to, but c'est la
That's
vie,
all right.
right?
That's all
So,
right. And it asked me to click that too. I was like, I don't know, but that's okay.
yeah, I think I was like, I saw you in, and then it was like join, and I think I hit anyway.
No, you're
Welcome.
good. I always try to come in a few minutes early for these because every now and then there's a technical problem, and I hate to panic at the end and not be able to join a meeting. So I'm always here a few minutes early if at all possible.
Right. So I was doing a little bit of homework on the history of sick codes. Um,
Old school, yeah.
yeah, just the origins of things and why we do what we do, and the 1900s. as
Yeah,
my as my kids would say.
it is, and there's still federal statutes out there that refer to sick codes. They just in recent years have finally amended some SBA and FAR regulations that still talked about it. It takes a long time when you make a change like going from sick to NAICS, and everyone knows you mean NAICS now under these rules, but that it's not great not to update these rules. So there are probably
Eh,
still some out there that say sick codes.
SCLS, SCA. I mean, everyone knows, but it's not
Yep.
SCA. But no one says SCLS.
Right. Terminology
Um,
stuff. And with the revolutionary fire overhaul, like everyone's citations to the fire are going to be wrong now
is
because
that the
they're
RFO? The
yeah,
RF?
our RFO, revolutionary fire overhaul. I've taken it just calling it the RFO fire to distinguish it from the baseline fire, which is still active, of course. It's still out there. It's just
Sure.
being deviated from currently. So
Yeah, there's
yeah.
been a cool online tool about that. The NCMA has been rolling out with Daniel Finkelstein.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Um, hey, I just realized I left coffee in the microwave. Give me 30
Oh, yeah. You don't
seconds.
want to do that. Yeah, I got
No,
your caffeine
I'll be
now.
right
So
back.
we'll see you in a second here.
Right. Where is our moderator?
Always helpful to have the moderator present. Otherwise, will be self moderating.
I'm gonna grab my phone. It's charging over here. Oh, can we just let everybody in? Okay, texts have been sent. So what else can you do?
What else can you do?
I know Chris might have been at a conference and trying to duck out. Um, that's what we get for having such a popular guy trying to do our moderations, right?
I'm telling you, right? In demand.
Well, it's good than the other way around, as the economist in me. It's been interesting, kind of seeing the industry morph and from different perspectives and different chairs that I've sat in the back office and compliance. I hear that word and I'm like, compliance with what?
Yeah, it's that in and of itself is a term you could spend a long time trying to unpack, and it's not always clear, especially with so many things changing these days. So yeah, compliance versus best practices versus
Oh,
maybe you need to do it, maybe you don't. It's a lot of that out there.
all right, all right, all right. We got the main man with the plan here, Mr. Riddick. Welcome, sir. I boned this up already and started 5 minutes early, but Steve and I have been having a good time here, just kind of conversing here, prepping the battlefield, so to speak. So,
The breeze.
well, welcome. You're on mute, buddy.
How about now?
There we go.
I'm saying those are some of the best conversations. The most valuable are the ones that are off the cuff and off the record, even though we've got dozens of people popping in here as we're talking.
And it's being recorded.
Right.
All right. So not off the record.
So yeah, we
Awesome.
probably should start with that disclaimer. This is being recorded, and I think there's some AI bots in here that, that's the world we live in, right?
I would guess half of them are AI bots. Awesome. Well, let's jump in. We've still got some people popping in here, but thank you guys for asking me to come and help navigate the conversation here. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from both of you, honestly. And I've been at GovCon for 7 or 8 years now, and I'm just a wee lad and still have a lot to learn. Yeah, let's start out with some introductions. Mr. John Barker, you were the first to reach out to me about this, and love to hear what you're about, what have you been up to, and how do you help people in GovCon?
Awesome. Well, thanks. I'm John Barker, the VP of Pricing for Strategic Growth Partners. We help tribal 8As and other types of small businesses get into the GovCon market. I've been in this space since I graduated college as an econ degree from UVA, Wahoo, back in 2000. So born and raised inside the Beltway. Procurement has kind of been in my blood. My parents are both civil servants. My grandparents are both buried in Arlington Cemetery. And so, I think transparency into the GovCon market is really what I'm all about. Trying to find right buyers and sellers, at matching and stuff like that. So kind of cutting my teeth in the contract administration field and kind of did a hot wash in my job, like, maybe 5-8 years ago or so, and was like, hey, I like this part about my job. I hate this part, and kind of settled into pricing. I like the risk and rewards and the terms and conditions and how they drive, decisions and, kind of P wins and factors like that. So, that's enough about me. Let's turn it over to Mr. Coprince here.
Yeah, well, thank you, John and Chris. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And, I'm one of those nerds who's like, NAICS goes, I got to join and talk about that. That's fun, So I've been working government contracting now for more than 20 years. I'm the founder and former managing partner of Coprince McCall Potroff LLC. That's a boutique law firm dedicated, exclusively to serving federal contractors and subcontractors. In my career, I've worked with more than 1,000 government contractors and subcontractors, mostly, but not exclusively, small businesses on issues of compliance and as well as consulting on kind of what's best for your business in the federal space. A lot of litigation as well, protests and all that stuff we're not going to talk about today. I did step back from legal work a couple years ago. Right now I'm focused on teaching, on board service, other activities. May pick up some limited part-time consulting later on this year. Haven't decided on that definitively yet, but it was getting a little burned out with the law. But that said, I love this field, and so right now I publish a lot on LinkedIn and on a blog and newsletter I have on federal contracting topics, and keep my ear to the ground on these topics and enjoy teaching and talking about them in depth. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us. And I'll give a brief introduction of myself. Named Chris Riddick. I'm the director of partnerships for GovBrew. We work to bring the most relevant, sometimes funny and interesting news in the GovCon industry to government contractors and agencies. We love to help find opportunities, find updates on compliance, and bring that to our audience of subscribers. And this will definitely be shared out to that group there. And I'll give a plug. You guys can give a plug later as well. So it's a free subscription, govbrew.co. There is a meme Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, every newsletter to get your morning started out with a funny, if you will. So, well, good deal. All right. So I'm just gonna start it because I told John that I would. How do we pronounce it? NAICS codes. That's how I pronounce it.
Yeah, NAICS rhymes with snakes, shakes, bakes, etc.
There you go. I just learned that yesterday. Rhymes with snakes. So yeah, I've heard NAICS and NICS and NICS code. So yeah, NAICS code is the way I think we're gonna pronounce it.
Yeah, and
All
in
right.
fact, I think this website has finally been changed. But at one point, the Census Bureau, which is in charge of the NAICS codes, not the size standard that FBA plugs into, but in charge of the NAICS codes themselves, had on their website, "Here's how you pronounce it," and said, so that's that's the
What are we
official
talking about
pronunciation
here?
from the government of what is clearly, just as you see it written out. It's not obvious how you pronounce that. So NAICS is how I've always said it.
Good deal. Well, now that we got the softball question out of the way, thank you guys for that. Let's do just we've got people that have been in the industry for years on here. We probably got some new blood as well. Quickly, I'll throw this to you, Steve, since it sounds like you love NAICS code so much. What was the foundation of the NAICS codes? Like a quick 30-second, why do they exist? How does the government use them?
Yeah, and so NAICS codes are a way that the government uses to classify industry in this country, and there's North Americans. They're used in Canada as well. And the government uses them for multiple purposes. For our purposes here in federal contracting, they are used not exclusively, but primarily then taken by the U.S. Small Business Administration, which then assigns a specific size standard to each NAICS code that's out there. Because there's a common misconception that there's a one-size-fits-all size standard to be a small business in federal contracting. If you're under 500 employees, you're a small business. I've seen that. And the actual answer is it depends on your industry. And the industries are defined by the NAICS codes. And then SBA goes in and says, to be an architect, you're small if you meet this standard. But to be a manufacturer of automobiles, it's going to take a lot more resources, personnel, equipment, et cetera. So it's a very, very different and much higher size standard to qualify as a small business there. So NAICS codes for government contracting purposes, and they pop up in different areas, but the primary one that leads discussion always is small business size standards are tied to NAICS codes.
Awesome. Thank you for the overview there. And we'll keep rolling with that. John, you and I were having a fun conversation yesterday about, you laughed at me when I said it. I'm going to say it again, hot NAICS codes. Is there such thing as a hot NAICS code? Is there a trend going on? And if there is, where do we go to find where the government's spending on certain codes? Or call me an idiot and rephrase the question.
You must be consuming a lot of TikTok and YouTube content with monetizing your NAICS codes. And, the granddaddy of them all, I would say, is 541330 engineering. And I think that's got some permutations with size standards, but generally it's about 30 million, something like that. So I think the NAICS codes are kind of, very meaningful and very meaningless at the same time. And what I mean by that is, Steve mentioned they're used by the SBA. The SBA uses the codes to determine what is or is not a small business. So Steve mentioned, a lot of the manufacturing ones, there's a lot more resource overhead intensive industries. So they give them a little bit of a grace and allow them to have 500 or 1,500 employees. Some of the smaller ones are more revenue size based. So there's a lot of gamesmanship in selecting NAICS codes from government procurements. I've seen, a lot of times early in my career, I was just asked by, capture teams, and I was trying to, be a good soldier and was like, hey, I'll switch to this NAICS code to a 3341, computer manufacturing design, something like that. And all of a sudden on the reps and certs, I could check small business and VOSP as well, rather than the large business, because we were running at like 700 million a year. So we were a $700 million a year small business in certain NAICS codes, but large in others. So we didn't want to compete in the large ones because then we were competing with behemoths like Booz Allen or CACI. But, so we would kind of strategically trying to, rig and kind of influence behind the scenes the selection of certain NAICS codes on opportunities that were in our pipeline. And it didn't necessarily translate to the actual work being performed, but it was like enough to where I'm very curious about Steve's perspective, in terms of the way. Let me back up a little bit. So you'd asked me a question yesterday, Chris, about how do you select your primary NAICS code? Like everyone who registers in SAM has to pick a primary one, then you can pick some secondary ones. Well, I always kind of advise folks to look at USA spending and look at your capabilities, and then kind of drill down the NAICS codes that your government agencies that you're targeting are using, because they could, I use software development. While there's a specific NAICS code for software development, there might be a dozen or so that are used amongst different agencies, and the Air Force may use these 3 ones very commonly, and the Army may use these 3, and they may not be the same.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump on that point, and I think in terms of selecting your NAICS codes in SAM, especially folks who are new to government contracting, one of the misconceptions is that if I qualify as a small business under my self-selected primary NAICS code, then I'm a small business for everything. And so some folks will go in and pick the NAICS code with the highest possible size standard. Like, I give myself a room to run. I'm a small business. I picked automobile manufacturing, even though I'm an attorney and I'm doing attorney work. And most people aren't going to go to that extreme, but they'll pick a high NAICS code that doesn't necessarily reflect the primary purpose of their business. So there is actually a regulation out there that tells you some of the factors you should be looking at when you're selecting your primary NAICS code. It's 13 CFR 124.107, I believe, is the regulation. That's an SBA regulation, but you do have discretion to self-certify. The notion with small business, though, is you have to qualify as a small business under the size standard applicable to any contract that you bid, because each federal procurement, almost every federal procurement, there are going to be some, OTAs and stuff that are not privy to these rules, but generally speaking, any solicitation that the government puts out on the street is going to be assigned a single NAICS code that best reflects the principal purpose of that acquisition in the eyes of the contracting officer and their rules. And the contracting officer has some level of discretion. We can't just pick any old NAICS code. It has to be reflective of the work that is being required under that acquisition. And then that NAICS code carries a corresponding size standard that has already been pre-assigned by SBA. And that's the size you need to qualify under, regardless of what your primary code says. So you could have a primary code in SAM under which you do not qualify as small. You're a large business under that code, and yet the government puts a solicitation on the street that has a different NAICS code, a secondary code, perhaps on your SAM profile, for which you do qualify as small. You could bid that work. No problem, even though you're not qualifying as small on your primary. The reverse is true too, that if you qualify as small on your primary code and the solicitation carries a code that has a smaller size standard, you can't bid that work as a small business because you're not small under the code that's designated for that work. And so I think when folks go in to pick their NAICS codes, they need, you need to divorce yourself a little bit from I need to pick a primary code that shows me to be small, if that doesn't really reflect your work, because ultimately your qualifications as a small business come down to the codes that are assigned to the work you're bidding. And so the NAICS code should reflect the work you do, that you want to do, rather than be focused primarily on whether you're a small business under that code.
And I'm curious about something. Oh, I'm so sorry. So I'm curious about something there, because to me, I've always, the solicitation always drives everything. And the solicitation, 99 times out of 100, they have a NAICS code on there. So whatever that NAICS code is, if you're bidding it clearly, you think you're going to win, then clearly if that NAICS code is not in your SAM or under your primary or secondary, does that prohibit you from bidding?
No, it doesn't. It's actually an interesting question, and I think as a best practice, you should include the NAICS code in your SAM of anything that you want to bid. And that's just you go into your SAM profile and edit it. So if you see a solicitation pop up that's a NAICS code that you don't have in your profile, nothing's stopping you from going into SAM and editing your profile and adding that code to your profile. That said, there is a common misconception, again, that if you don't have NAICS code whatever on your profile, 541330, for example, 236220, another common code in construction, that you can't be bid or be awarded a contract that's designated with that code. That's not true. In fact, there's a GAO case that I wrote about on my blog, shameless plug, fedlift.substack.com is the FedLift blog. And I wrote about that a couple months ago, in which that exact scenario happened, that the awardee did not have the solicitation's NAICS code listed on its SAM profile. A protester came in and said they're ineligible because they don't list the solicitation's NAICS code. And the GAO said nope, and in fact said, we ruled on this issue twice before, pointed to 2 previous cases in which the same result had occurred, and said you don't have to have a specific NAICS code in SAM to be awarded a contract. You have to have a SAM profile. You have to have an active SAM profile, but you don't have to have the solicitation's NAICS code listed. Now, there may be, exceptions if the solicitation itself said you had to list the NAICS code, then maybe there would be a case where you did because you were now violating the solicitation terms, but there's nothing in the FAR that requires that. But again, it's a best practice, and so that contracting officers are going to look at your SAM profile and know that you do that kind of work and find you in their market research. You should list it, but you're not ineligible if you don't. If you forget to list it, you can still win a contract with that code.
Good deal. We've got a statement in the chat that is asking for some clarification. The person says your primary NAICS is also on your business tax papers. SAM is irrelevant to this individual. SA is going to look at the NAICS on the tax papers. Is that person correct or incorrect?
I'd love to answer that from my perspective.
Yeah, then I'll jump in on that too. So go ahead, Kevin. You go
so first. Yeah, while the SBA uses it and as applicable to Fed GovCon, they use it to determine the size standard. Now, as I mentioned, the NAICS code is ubiquitous by all the census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So there's a lot of other things that I'm tying into. Shameless plug into an app that I've been building. So to Gloria's point, one of the apps that I'm using is trying to quantify a wrap rate, a difference between the top line revenue and the bottom line payroll, that consists of fringe overhead, G&A, and profits. And so what I believe the source of that data is from the Census Economic every 5 years by decennial, something like that. But that's based on underlying tax returns that are PII stripped, but they're categorized by those 6-digit NAICS codes. Steve, I would love your thoughts on there.
Yeah, and so, in my experience working with small businesses with, and thank you for the question, Gloria, that's a good one. To qualify for certification right now is an 8A small business in the 8A program, and we're not going to get into all the upheaval in that program right now, but let's just say you're applying for the 8A program. You have to still qualify as a small business under your primary NAICS code to be admitted to the 8A program. And that used to be the case for some of SBA's other certifications as well, such as economically disadvantaged women-owned small business. And they've removed that requirement for their other certification programs, simply saying you have to qualify as small for any NAICS code listed on your SAM profile. But for 8A, you still have to be a small business in your primary NAICS. And so the 8A application process is pretty intensive. And one thing that you have to submit to SBA with your 8A application are the tax returns of the company. And certain tax returns do require you to list a NAICS code on your tax return document, as a single NAICS code on your tax return document. And so if the SBA is in processing an 8A application, sees a disconnect between the NAICS code you listed as primary and SAM and the disconnect and a different NAICS code on your tax returns, they, in my experience, will come back and say, what's going on here? Like your tax returns say your NAICS code is X, your SAM profile says it's Y. We're concerned. Tell us what's going on here. And what happened in my experience, again, working with folks in this situation, a lot of times it was just a bookkeeper or an accountant or somebody who just picked whatever old NAICS code. They weren't thinking about government contract. They're just like, yeah, I think that company's construction, so I'm going to pick 236220. It's a general construction code, when in fact this company is a specialty trade construction company. They should have picked an HVAC code, for example, something along those lines. So you can clear that up with SBA, but it really, my experience when it came up was in certification applications, and now it should be limited to only those 8A. That's the only case in which you have to be small in your primary code, and SBA is trying to determine in those cases whether the primary code you're self-certifying as is actually the right one. Or if you are kind of misidentifying a code with a larger size there in order to get into 8A, something like that.
Yeah. John, I've got a question for you, unless you want to tag on to what Steve was saying there.
No, I'm just still buzzing about hot NAICS codes. So,
you're welcome.
I'm trying to come up with something clever, and it's just not.
I don't even have TikTok, so it's just. Yeah.
No, you know what I'm talking about, like the jokers that'll guarantee contracts in like 3 months, middlemanning their way to success, and it's about it's value add. It's always value add, So the NAICS codes are one of those things, again, like whether you're bidding or not, it makes you eligible or not. So it's extremely meaningful at a very tactical level, but strategically, I don't think it's kind of meaningful at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm following you.
I mean, because again, businesses morph. Like, there's not an AI industry. Will there be? I don't know. But I mean, these things evolve during time. Like, I wanted to get into, I had my Gemini bot talk about the evolution of the SIC codes, which came around in the 1930s, right? And, think about it. They were trying to measure farming and forestry, and then mining, fisheries, construction, trades, and then it kind of evolved to, goods producing to services producing. And now it's kind of, in an evolution, and I expect the 2027 one that'll come out in 2030 will be, a lot of new industries, a lot of different ones that'll change those NAICS codes and probably put some little, more alpha numerical subsets. This is a 750, this is a 1250 now employee size standard, because we did a lot of aerospace manufacturing, and a lot of those were revenue based, but then there was an exception that made it employee based. So it was like, I think it was 541 7112, like R&D. So there's a lot of just, weird stuff. And I don't know about the legalities of it, but it's like, oh, I'm a contracts person certifying that, yeah, we're doing this because that's what we're doing. But overall, it's not in my core line of business. Like, I'll disclose something to you from a conversation a controller had with me one time when we were doing tax returns, and we were saying we were under a software manufacturing company. He's like, we don't manufacture any software at all. Are we committing fraud? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, all I know is that's on the solicitation. We're bidding it. I'm good to go signing off on it. Or I'm, good to say that my boss is good to sign off on it. I don't know. Like, are there any risks there?
Yeah. And so, that's a good question, actually. And so folks who are selling products to the government that they themselves did not manufacture, the government will still put a manufactured products code, or just a products code. If it's not manufactured, it could be a code for, food, bananas or whatever, Whole Foods or something. But they will put a product code on the solicitation. And so then the question is, okay, well, I don't manufacture the product. I'm selling the product that somebody else manufactured, provide them a distributor or a broker, whatever the, value-added reseller, whatever the terminology is. And there's different rules we're not going to get into in terms of non-manufacturer rule and when that qualifies. But let's assume that you're comfortable that, yeah, I qualify to bid this stuff. Can you still add those manufacturing codes to your profile? Can you still bid that work? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, the government's not supposed to put a code. These codes exist, but they're not supposed to put codes for resale, for distribution, et cetera, on a federal solicitation, because they're supposed to always put the code that reflects the principal purpose of the acquisition. And the government's mindset is the principal purpose is never the resale, it's the product. So we put the product code on the acquisition because that's what we're buying. We don't care whether it comes directly from the manufacturer or from a middleman, perhaps, but we want the product. We don't want the resale. And so that's why the government will put a manufacturing code on there. And if you're a reseller, you can list those manufacturing codes on your profile. You can bid that work, again, assuming that you know that you qualify to do that under the rules that apply. People hear about non-manufacturer and they think, well, I'm not a manufacturer, so I'm a non-manufacturer. And in fact, it's a 4-part test under the SBA's rules that you have to meet to qualify for that status. But assuming you've gone through that work and you say, yeah, we qualify, we meet that 4-part test. If it's a non-manufacturer situation, yeah, you can put those codes on your profile and bid that work because you're still supplying the government with those products, even though you're not manufacturing yourself. By putting it on your SAM profile, you're not representing to the world that you manufacture it. You're representing that this is something you either provide or would like to provide to the government. That's it.
That brings up a good point. Is like, how does the government use the NAICS code, specifically, like, people looking for industry to provide solutions for their challenges and problems? So, I always kind of assumed that they use those NAICS codes. Someone's in SAM, it's their primary or secondary, that company would come up in a search if that contracting officer is only looking at a NAICS code. Is that still kind of the case, or is that how they're used by the government? I mean, other than also to, I feel like a lot of times in RFIs, there's normally a NAICS code on there, but a lot of times I advise, like, that's an opportunity to shape it to a NAICS code that might be, more favorable, create a favorable environment for your company versus, any of your companies that you might be competing against for whatever reason.
Yeah, so two good points there, and let me kind of address those separately. So first things first, how's the government using NAICS codes? Yeah, one of them is going to be part of the market research. There are other ways that they'll search for potential offers that are out there, depending on the acquisition. If it's VA searching for a SD they'll use that database, for example, that they have of those companies. They might also search using product service codes, which is a different type of code. But yeah, they will use NAICS codes when searching for potential doing market research to see who are the potential offerers if we do an acquisition for X, Y, or Z. And that can, in turn, that market research can shape whether that acquisition is a small business set aside or whether it goes out as an 8A or hub zone or whatever, but especially if they're required to use this rule of two, the rule of two set aside rule that applies to many acquisitions, not all, but many acquisitions in which if the government has a reasonable belief that two or more small businesses that are capable are likely to submit offers at fair market prices, and they're supposed to either set aside that work for small business or use some sort of small business subset, such as 8A hub zone, what have you. So those NAICS codes can influence the market research, and the government can use them to help determine who the likely competitive playing field is. It's one of their many tools they have at their disposal for market research. On the shaping the solicitation, that's a great point that you raised, because it's the NAICS code, whether it's put in some sort of solicitation document, such as an RFI, such as a pre-solicitation, whatever the government might put out in certain acquisitions, and sometimes they don't do that. Sometimes they just drop an RFP, and there was nothing that industry saw before that. But for a lot of the larger, more complex acquisitions, there's going to be pre-solicitation documents that are out there. And so, the contractors now have an opportunity to potentially help shape that competitive playing field. Because as we talked about, each NAICS code carries a corresponding size standard. Those size standards can vary considerably. And so there are going to be some NAICS codes in which your company may qualify as small and others in which it does not. There may be some NAICS codes in which your competitors may qualify as small and which they do not. And so if the NAICS code comes out on the solicitation or pre-solicitation document, and it has a NAICS code with a very high associated size standard, that's a larger competitive playing pool than if it has a much smaller size standard. That's going to be a smaller competitive playing field. And so contractors, depending on their market position, may say, "Look, I'm only a $5 million company. I see a solicitation come out with a $45 million size standard. I'm not bidding that thing. That's a general construction project or whatever. I'm going to be competing against $40 million companies. I don't want to bid that thing. But if it comes out with a $19 million size standard, maybe I can win that work. That's a specialty trade type size standard, HVAC, masonry, plumbing, what have you. And so you can either informally in the pre-solicitation way, and I've had these conversations with contracting officers, say, "Hey, I don't think this is the NAICS code that best fits the principal purpose of the acquisition." That's the government's job, is to pick the NAICS code that best fits the principal purpose of the acquisition. If the government doesn't do that, then they've actually committed a mistake. And so you can appeal that. You can appeal that to the SBA itself, and they can order the government to put in the NAICS code that is the better fit for the solicitation. And those appeals themselves can dramatically change the competitive playing field, either increasing it or shrinking it. And you file those with SBA after the solicitation itself drops, or you can even informally shape it on the front end by having those conversations in an RFI, for example, that, "Hey, I don't think this NAICS code is correct. It doesn't reflect the principal purpose of the acquisition."
Yeah, I wanted to just take this opportunity real quick to showcase one of the things about the NAICS codes and the hierarchical aspect for it. So I just did an industry synopsis on the top level 5413, which is architecture, engineering, and related services. And so between those NAICS codes, there's a lot of stuff going on here. But between those, there's all these different codes underneath it, right? So if you're doing kind of engineering, I could pick any one of these codes and not really be wrong. But the size standards in here, say I'm a $12 million annual business, then I don't want to pick that one, because then I'm competing with companies double my size. I don't want to do 9 because I'm right at like 11 and a half. I want to strategically pick this one on a pre-award basis, right? And an RFI, a sources sought, and pick that one because I know there's other companies that are, maybe cheaper than I am that are double, 20 some mil that I can exclude, block the company's glory. And thanks for that question. Again, we're all competing here. We all want to put our best foot forward. But if we know how to kind of game the system to our benefit, wouldn't we do that every day? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thanks for letting me indulge there.
No, that's good. And I just want to give a couple examples. I wrote an article a couple months ago about, altering the NAICS code, contractors helping shape the solicitation with NAICS codes. And I had a couple examples in this article. Again, it's on my blog, FedLift Launchpad, fedlift.substack.com, of cases that were at SBA last year in which a company appealed the NAICS code. And so here's you can see some amazing examples here. There's a case in which a company appealed the NAICS code to SBA, said it's not the right fit for this solicitation. The SBA agreed, and the NAICS code, the size standard rose from 25 million to 1,250 employees. It went from a services code to a manufacturing code. So imagine the change in the competitive field from a 25 million to 1,250 employees. Another case in which the NAICS code size standard appeal was successful, the NAICS code jumped from 20 million to 47 million, allowing that company to qualify for something it hadn't qualified for. And it went the other direction too. There's a case in which a company appealed and the NAICS code changed based on the appeal. The size standard dropped from 34 million to 13 million. Another one in which it dropped from 40 million to 30 million. And so contractors were successful in using that tool to alter the competitive playing field to their advantage, either by taking a solicitation that they weren't eligible for and making themselves eligible for it by having that size standard increase, or taking a solicitation in which the competitive playing field was pretty big and shrinking it down to a smaller field of companies that were more like that protester in terms of their size.
And I got to say, I worked for a lot of companies around the Beltway, or early in my career in particular, that strategically stayed right around, $1 million or $2 million below their size standard, so they can kind of continue to operate as they're in their 8A sole source or whatever sole source they had available to them. So, to each their own, right? But again, I think the NAICS codes, there's a lot of opportunities to kind of game the system to your benefit, but also, think tactically and strategically. Again, while it's kind of you always have to certify to some sort of NAICS code from every bid that you submit, again, on the Fed side. But at the same time, always think about augmenting your SAM to make sure that if a contracting officer does look at it, that it's at least on there. But it doesn't exclude you from doing it. But as you said, Steve, you can kind of live edit it, live, keep adding those things. And then you see that's why companies have 600 NAICS codes, because they're not in mining yet,
Some go a little too far, just like, put them all in there. It's like, no. That's, you want to include things. And I've told clients, look, you don't have to include only codes in which you're actually doing work. You can consider related codes in which you'd like to do work, in which you're interested in bidding. That's fine. But yeah, don't include random codes that you have no relationship to, you're never going to do. If you're an engineering firm and then you include mining, well, that's probably not a jump you're going to make anytime soon. Be an interesting business decision, but unlikely. So yeah, don't go overboard, because the contract officer may look at that and be like, wow, jack of all trades, master of none. Like, we can't tell really what you do based on this.
Yeah. So your side hustle is a classic car dealer. You might not qualify as an auto dealership, but
that's right.
Maybe separate the business entities into two different things. Don't muddy the waters there.
So, Steve, you brought up a good point there. So, businesses, especially in federal government, seem to always be growing and changing. Adapting is probably the best word right now. Should they be, if they do decide, okay, I've got a little bit of interest and some background in this specific NAICS code over here. Once they decide, okay, I'm gonna start chasing things there. Is there a way to market that to the government agencies to make sure that people are actually seeing that, okay, they're not just throwing the number on there, they're actually pursuing work in this, outside of course, just responding to RFPs?
Yeah, and some folks who do more of the capture may be better able to answer that than I do as the compliance side. But yeah, I mean, at that point, you're updating your capability statements, and you're making connections with contracting officers. You're potentially growing a little bit of experience in that field somewhere else, maybe as a subcontractor or something else. So you can go to that agency and say, yeah, we We don't just want to do this. We are doing it, especially if it's not directly related to what you're primarily doing. Another strategy I've seen folks do so is not to muddy the waters. If it really is a different line of work, if it really is we're engineering here and we're mining here, some folks that I've worked with have said, you know what, we're concerned that we're not going to have a company that people really understand if we're doing these two related, seemingly unrelated or not closely related fields. So we're going to start an affiliated company. And affiliation gets a naughty word in government contract. It's bad, but you can be affiliated. Like there's nothing wrong with having an affiliate so long as the combined sizes don't exceed a size standard. So say, look, we're gonna start an affiliate in this other line of work, and then we're going to have a clean, separation between the two in a public-facing way. One of us is going to be the mining company, the other is going to be the engineering company, but we're still under the same ownership umbrella. The final way I've seen folks do this is by buying past performance, which is using M&A, which is by going out there and saying, look, instead of just starting a startup in this industry, we want to get involved. We want to do that, but the best way to do that more quickly is to purchase a small business, perhaps that is already in that industry, that has done some contracts successfully, that we can use that record of past performance. And if not that, then we're going to bring on some key personnel and try to use their individual past performance. So there are different strategies that folks can use to try to accelerate that growth curve into a new industry. And John probably has some thoughts on that as well.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment on some of the feedback coming in on the comments. Is that I think one thing that's important to consider is that we're not always talking about a small business set aside, right? So while a NAICS code is always on a solicitation, it's not always a small business set aside. So I just want to make that distinction. So someone asked a question about if a solicitation comes out in a code that is not in their secondary. Again, not a big deal. Go ahead and add it to it, but feel free to bid as long as you think you can bid it and be successful on it. Steve, I forgot your lot of conversation, but I just wanted to make that distinction because I think there's a little bit of confusion there. So you're always allowed to bid it if it's a full and open. If you're a small, you might get some additional credit, additional evaluative scoring criteria. You may be able to afford a lower price or a higher price depending on, again, section L and M.
Great point, John. If it's an unrestricted contract, not set aside for small business or some subcategory, anybody can bid. You can bid. Google can bid. Amazon can bid. Whatever. Then the NAICS code does not influence your eligibility to bid on that solicitation. However, if you qualify as small, you may still get some benefits from that. One of the other benefits, in addition to those John mentioned, is that if you're a small business under an unrestricted solicitation and you win that contract, you're not subject to a small business subcontracting plan. You don't have to do what a large business would do and adopt a small business subcontracting plan that promises work to certain categories of small businesses, because you yourself are small as a prime. So that being small on an unrestricted acquisition can still bring some benefit.
And I think that brings up a good point, because in a lot of OTSBs, other than small business opportunities, you'll see a lot of times where there is a small business subcontracting plan in there. And so through one of the blogs I think you submitted, you wrote maybe a year or two ago, Steve, I always assumed that when I'm doing a small business plan, I'm using the NAICS code that's in my solicitation. So I would kind of cram that as the small size standard between all my suppliers. And at one point, one of my suppliers graduated out of their code. And I had told them that they needed to stay in that code because what they were telling me was a kind of a computer. It was like one that I didn't buy, basically. And I was worried about the risk and audit risk, compliance of, someone coming in and say, wait, you certified that this woman-owned small business and you knew they were 45 million and the size standard was 42, and you continue to submit their small business numbers. Right. But I didn't. I moved them all over at a certain 6-month interval into OTSB, which, tanked our numbers. But I thought it was proper. But then when I saw your blog, I was like, oh, shoot, I could have continued to report the same numbers if I just kind of switched over their reps inserts to me, say, hey, certify under these NAICS codes, and then I can continue to report you as small. I thought, anyway.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because, and this is something that for the small businesses on this session here, if you're serving as a subcontractor, you've probably seen this before, which is you get a prime contractor who issues you a subcontract document, and they basically expect you to just kind of sign it as is. A lot of these primes do, not all, and it will say, self-cert. We require you to certify that you're a small business under penalty of whatever. You're going to give us your firstborn child if your certification is incorrect. I mean, they're very aggressive. Like, you have to certify that you're a small business, right? Because they want to be able to count you toward their small business subcontracting plan. But they don't tell you the size standard or a NAICS code. And so you're certifying under what? I don't know, $19 million, 1,250 employees. You're just certifying that you're small. And so the common misconception here is that the NAICS code and size standard from the prime contract flow down to the subcontract. That if you're awarded a prime contract, that's the NAICS code and size standard that apply to all the subcontracts. In fact, that's not true. The prime contractor has the obligation under both the SBA's regulations and in the FAR, the portion regarding small business subcontracting plans, to assign the NAICS code that best fits the subcontractor's scope of work, which may be different than the NAICS code that best fits the prime contractor's scope of work. And so construction is a great example of where this happens all the time, because the prime contractor is assigned a general construction code like 236220. It contains a $45 million size standard. The prime then goes and subs out a bunch of the trades. They're subbing out the plumbing, they're subbing out masonry, they're subbing out HVAC, all that, and painting, whatever. And so those subcontract documents should not be assigned a general construction NAICS code, because those subs aren't doing general construction. They're doing especially trade construction. And so those subcontractors should be self-certifying under the appropriate code for their work, which is a $19 million size standard. So you can see a situation where primes are going to get in trouble, because they're going to award to a $30 million painting company, assuming that this $45 million general construction size standard applies, and it doesn't. And the sub could potentially get in trouble too, because they self-certify that they're small, not against any particular NAICS code, when in fact under the NAICS code for the work that they're doing, they're not small. They're $11 million in my example of the size standard. So primes need to know that large, and I've had to have this conversation as a representative of small business subs with the reps for large primes all the time, saying, hey guys, like my client would love to self-certify as small, but first you have to tell us against what size standard. And so, and they're like, well, we never put one in our stuff. I'm like, well, that's a you problem. That's not we need one in this document so that we know what we're certifying to.
Yeah. Well, is there so lots of planning should be done with NAICS codes and reviews and everything. Is there a good process or tools out there that you guys would suggest, like, hey, this is how often you should be reviewing your NAICS codes and what you're chasing? This is the process of thinking through where we should we go. I mean, it's a capture strategy decision, really, but any tips out there for companies, like, hey, you should be doing these things regularly?
Well, I'm still buzzing again about the hot NAICS codes. And so the economist in me is like, well, what do you want? The one that has the most companies registered in it? Sure. That indicates the most supply of companies performing that, right? So, but again, you think about it from the buyer's perspective. Okay, now I'm trying to find a company in 30,000. How do I differentiate from that? So, right, is the hot one then the one that's undervalued? Right? The one where there's the minimal amount of competition that's unused because you haven't flexed your influential muscles, because you now are armed with this knowledge and how to kind of say, hey, in RFIs, I always want to put this one because there's only 5 other people in SAM.gov registered in it. I don't know. So there's a couple different ways that I would try to kind of attack that problem, Chris, depending on what my strategy is for my company. My boss, John Cooks, likes to say land and expand. So, I kind of look at it from what am I capable of? What kind of jobs do I really think that me and my team and my network of, suppliers and vetted subcontractors can perform? And then I look at like targeted agencies and how they're applying NAICS codes to my capabilities. And then I'll run some kind of CRM funnels into those agencies with those NAICS codes. But then when, the land and expand part, once I identify the 3 to 5 target customers, and when I say customers, I mean like specific 6-digit identifiers, which are, again, ubiquitous in every single solicitation and every single contract award, we're talking 100% Fed. there's a lot of beauty in there. And so once you start kind of getting your capabilities in front of those customers, then you also see what they're buying in associated NAICS codes. Then you can kind of expand your capabilities because you're already in with that customer. You know what they care about, you know what's important, you know how they're measuring success, and then you can expand into other line of business because they already know, like, and trust you.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's great. I'll just add a couple of things to that if I could really quickly. So first, I think most folks on here, if you're in SAM, then you know that you're required to re-up your SAM profile at least once annually. So that's a great opportunity for not just doing the paperwork, but taking a look at what you have on there and making sure it still aligns with your business. And you don't have to wait for that annual update to update your SAM. You can update it anytime, like we've been talking about. If you see a solicitation with a NAICS code on it that you want to pursue that's not in your SAM, you can update it now. You don't have to wait till that annual reauthorization of your SAM profile. But that annual moment is a good time to just kind of do a little due diligence and make sure that you're still aligned in terms of your NAICS codes with where you are and where you want to go in the coming year. The second thing I would mention is that every 5 years or so, the SBA will take a look at the size standards associated with each NAICS code and potentially adjust those for inflation. They do that on a rolling basis through the different NAICS codes, so they're not all done at once. They'll do different sectors, and they go out and gather a lot of economic data and do a bunch of complicated math that my little lawyer brain can't understand, and then they say, like, here's the new size standards. And so that's also a good time when you see one of those rules come out in your industry to take a look at your NAICS code and say, hey, did SBA's changes maybe open up some possibilities for us that weren't there before? Because we're mainly pursuing small business set-asides. Again, if you're going on restricted, it's not affecting your eligibility. But if you're going after small business contracts, there may be NAICS codes in which you didn't qualify as small, but all of a sudden SBA comes in, changes some size standards, and suddenly you're skating under. So there may be more opportunities there. So when those rules come out from SBA, those adjustments, those inflationary adjustments, it could be a good opportunity just to revisit your NAICS codes, your eligibility, and see if there may be some new opportunities out there for you.
And I would say also, just as a general practice, when you're bidding something and it isn't on there, go ahead and add it then.
Yeah,
just to make sure, because when those KOs look at those things, they're supposed to look at it multiple times, and any glitch they find, you don't want them to, find any obstacles in awarding your company a contract.
And in fact, two things could happen there. One, the contracting officer could get the impression that you don't actually do this kind of work, and so that could gum up your award a little bit. Second thing is the contracting officer too could think, if you don't have the NAICS code, you're not eligible. And I actually had a case like that in my legal career, it's probably about 10 or 12 years ago now, where my client got excluded because they didn't have the NAICS code that was assigned to solicitation in their SAM profile, or at the time, the precursor to SAM, probably. I don't remember when exactly.
Orca.
Yeah, Orca, that's it.
CCR.
So we filed a protest, kind of reversing the scenario, saying we didn't have to have that NAICS code listed to be eligible, and we won the protest. And so, but you don't want to have. This company had to pay money to hire an attorney to file a protest, but you don't have to do that.
You want the easy path.
Correct. So from what I'm here, to kind of sum it all up, is just pay close attention. Keep your NAICS codes up to date. Know what you're chasing. Make sure you have your NAICS listed on every submission, even if they don't ask for it. But really also, so we've talked a little bit about gaming NAICS codes. I think somebody posted that earlier today, which is definitely a thing. But really, the best way to do it is be good at the work that you're doing. Make sure that it matches, your NAICS codes. And if you want to expand, like you said, get that past performance, or build a case for being in the NAICS code. Don't just throw it on there and be a jack of all trades just because you want to try to win some business. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best approach. John, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all kind of starts with like your capability statement, right? I got kind of a little butt hurt one time, pardon my French, moderating a panel when I suggested, using multiple NAICS codes, like 3 to 5 on a capability statement. And those 3 to 5 are selected because that targeted capability statement for that government agency is using those NAICS codes. And this person said, who worked for one VA office for their entire 30-year career, told me they would throw the capabilities treatment in the trash with multiple NAICS codes on it. And I was like, well, forgive me, but the hundreds of other agencies I've supported, that's a standard practice. So, to each their own, always be learning. But again, I think it's all about, very targeted, what that agency NAICS codes they're using, and you're putting that on your capability statement. Again, so knowing what you're capable of, it always starts with that, and, again, to use the land and expand part, when you go in with like, I want to do all these things, you're too freaking big to fit in the door. So you got to start narrow and then you can expand, but you got to be real nichey. And from an economist, a supply and demand curve, right? Like the reason why you need to differentiate yourself is because you didn't niche lower and lower on the supply, which then you can derive your own price. Right. And that's what it's all about in business, is to, kind of figure out which NAICS codes apply, but which ones, where's the gray where I can kind of not exploit it, but leverage it to my benefit for my company, for this particular context, which is this tactical bid.
Absolutely.
Can I quickly just answer a question that popped up? I think that's great stuff, John, by the way. That popped up from Lisa that also looks like someone else had asked. And I think this is important just to clarify some of the discussion we had earlier. And the question was, if the NAICS code that's assigned to a solicitation is one in which the company is not a small business, it's too large for that NAICS code, can they still bid on the RFP? Or whether the NAICS code is essentially a suggestion or a requirement. And the answer is, as with everything in government contracting, is it depends. And so if we're talking about a small business set aside or any type of contract that is restricted by size, and that would include 8A, hub zone, woman-owned small business, service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, veteran-owned, all those subsets of small business. But if small business size is a part of that, it's restricted to small business or subcategory of small business, then it is a requirement. If you bid on a solicitation in which you do not qualify as small under the size standard, and that work is set aside for small business or subcategory, then you are falsely certifying that you are small. Unfortunately, your bid is a certification that you meet that size standard. You can get size protested. You could get in worse trouble than that. So you don't want to do that. If it's an unrestricted contract, one in which there is no restriction based on size, then you can bid it. Then the NAICS code is not a suggestion. It still determines who qualifies as small for that solicitation, but instead of determining eligibility, it determines the various, whatever benefits may attach to being small, such as not having to complete a small business subcontracting plan, but it does not affect eligibility. So I hope that answers your question there. It sounds like a couple people had asked it, saying what did relate right back to our earlier discussion. So I just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah. So if it's a qualification process, stop, do not pass, right? If you're qualified or you're not, you can't bid it. So a lot of companies will find a partner that is eligible for it and then do, half the work or, 20% of the work or whatever they're eligible for to stay compliant with the excessive pass-through charges. And a lot of those are also contingent upon the services which the government will classify as NAICS codes.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic add on there, John, because if you're in that situation, you can't bid solo as the prime, but you could participate in that acquisition as a subcontractor to somebody who does qualify as small, or potentially under the SBA's mentor protege program as a mentor protege joint venture. And that's a totally different topic we're not going to get into here, but there are avenues to participate in that acquisition, just not as the prime contractor in its own right, because then small business set-asides wouldn't actually be set aside for small business. They'd be another species of unrestricted contract.
Yeah, so always be networking. Like, I always would look for companies to kind of align themselves with companies similarly situated, right? And a lot of times, veteran owned, I'm like, find a women owned small businesses that's in your, you might be competimates, right? You might unlock the door to different contracts because you as a service eligible business, you'll always subcontract to them. In the women owned space, they'll subcontract to you. So again, kind of always be networking and figuring out how you can, I like to discern friends or foes. Like, is this somebody I want to work with, someone or I would rather compete with? I'm fine either way. I just want to know. And how do you establish that? Well, you got to get out there and kind of network and work with people. And, you did this, I can leverage your past performance here. That increases our probability of win. We may have this deal down here. We're unsure if it might go this set aside or that set aside. If it goes that set aside, then let's agree that I'll be on your team. But if it goes this way, then we'll agree that you'll sub to me.
Yeah,
and that
you can
happens
do
all
that.
the time.
Perfect. And you can do that with large and small too. If this opportunity goes unrestricted, a large business will be the prime, but we'll sub to small business to meet our subcontracting goals. If it goes small business set aside, small business will be the prime, and we'll subcontract some scope of work to large within the subcontracting limits that apply to that. And
if it goes both,
teaming agreements.
If it goes both, then we'll both bid, and then we'll be
then
non-exclusive.
We'll both bid, and we're just good luck to each of us.
Then I got 100 teammates.
That's right. So, but competimates, I like that. I'm gonna use that moving forward.
It's not me. I think Stephanie Alexander from Boost.
Oh yeah, she's great too. So
yeah, Stephanie's great.
So,
good deal.
Okay. Well, any other questions from the audience? I think this has been very good. Very good discussion here, Steve and Chris. Thank you for participating and joining me on this wild goose chase here. I'd love to do this again at some point. And any other questions out there?
Yeah, somebody made a statement to make sure that these details are logged in teaming agreements. So handshakes only go so far, as Steve, I'm sure you're aware of. So having good quality teaming agreements before you bid on things is important to know. Back to are you frenemies or not? That's what you're saying.
I will say this though, real quick. At the end of the day, though, teaming agreements are all about trust, and they're kind of meaningless. Right. I had a new client I was working, and was massaging the teaming agreement about an expectation of what would happen with a key personnel, and like what would be the conditions where they would be allowed to leave. Right, their job as a key personnel. And it was just interesting because he was going back and forth. I was like, dude, what do you want here? Like, yeah, we could go back one more time and ask him to clarify where they budged it already. But like at the end of the day, WTF? Like, do you trust them or not? There's only so much I can do. The subcontract obliterates that whole thing anyway. Yes, we should set that as the context. But again, I'm going to renegotiate everything.
Yeah, teaming agreements are great. They are limited. I think, as you said, John, if you win the work, you get the subcontract's going to replace team agreement. Team agreement's a chasing the contract document, and the subcontract's a performing the work document. But it is, I still think, good practice to put those things in writing, make sure everyone's committed to the same stuff in advance, especially scope of work. I see a lot of teaming agreements out there in which you got a lovely, beautiful boilerplate. And I was, Laura like, oh, it's a great boilerplate, love it. But then when you get to the scope, it's like, prime may assign, may subcontract up to 10% of the work to subcontractor. Well, what is subcontractor entitled to? Nothing, because up to 10 includes 0. So be careful when you're negotiating these things that you're actually paying attention to some of the stuff. And also keep in mind that if you do come across one of these partners that you do like and you do trust, and you are going to maybe bid multiple acquisitions with, you can play with the teaming agreement document. We used to do what I called master subcontract or master teaming agreements, in which we had all the boilerplate in one document, and then a one-pager they could fill out for each contract they're going to use that teaming agreement on. So just to fill out some of the specifics. So they'd already pre-negotiated the boilerplate and just had to fill out a one-pager every time they decided to team for a project.
I love that because I was always kind of wrapping my head around, we had an IDIQ. Right. Then our guys wanted to do teaming agreements when we had IDIQs. Like, why the heck are we going to do a team? Like, all we're really doing is negotiating a work share. Right. But we already had an IDIQ. So I was like, let's just come up with an MOU or something like that. And I love what you said about the statements of work, because too many primes will just give you every dang thing. And I'm like, no. Just like cut out like this and that section of the PWS, and then align that with the work share and make it commensurate with something they're providing in exchange. They're writing this part or that part, or they're going to do the orals, and they're going to be this representative of this, capability for us. So, but at the end of the day, it's all about winning and, learning how to kind of game the system in a way that puts your company at the best advantage is important to know.
Absolutely. And, teaming agreements, while we're talking about, it's a great place to get aligned on what the right NAICS code for that subcontract is too. Why get surprised when the subcontract comes along? You can say, write the teaming agreement, subcontractor will certify as part of its subcontract that it's a small business under NAICS code, blah, 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 whatever is the right code for its work. So that's a great place to get aligned and not have to have that back and forth after the government's awarded the project and you're trying to get out there and start performing. You can pre-negotiate this stuff as part of the teaming agreement.
I have to disclose, my head just exploded a little bit because I was thinking about former life where I was an SBLO, right? a small business liaison officer where I was tracking small business plans. And I was just thinking of the nightmarish scenario if I had the same supplier, small and large, in multiple NAICS codes across my enterprise. And how in the heck would I do an enterprise reporting when I have to be like, oh, crud. So anyway, maybe that's a topic for discussion next time in systems, if we know any companies that track those sort of things. But that's just where my head went there. So I apologize.
Yeah, it's good stuff, and we'll have to get into that next time because I want to pick your brain about all that SBLO stuff too, because that's really good information that I'm sure a lot of folks would be interested in hearing.
Good deal. Well, thank you guys. I think a lot of people are starting to drop for the next meetings, but thank you, Strategic Growth Partners, for helping put this together. And honored to be here from GovBrew. And Steve and John, you guys, lots of nice words about you guys down here. So I think most people liked it. And if they didn't like it, they didn't say, and that's fine. We will send the recording out to everybody. And we'll make sure, we'll have ways to reach Steve and John as well if you guys want to follow up with them with any additional questions or need assistance in your businesses. So, all right, you guys have a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you
Later,
both.
guys.
And thanks to everyone for attending.
And thank you, Chris, for emceeing this thing. It's been a great time. Thank you, Steve, for participating. And thank you all for your attendance. We'll send out the recording like Chris said, and you all have a wonderful rest of your day.